What are the most common myths confronted by supporters of gifted and talented education? And how can we create a brain-friendly classroom for the gifted students in order to debunk these myths?
I think we create a great classroom for all students when we have fascinating things to do, lots of questions to answer, including the questions the kids ask. The teacher who's looking at individuals and saying, you know what, he's been coasting here for a while, and I think I'd like to help that kid move on, even if he doesn't want to. I think that's my responsibility too. And then also says, every kid in this class has so much capacity. I'm not real sure that I want to say some of them are gifted, because as soon as I've said that, I have also said the rest of them are not. Now, I don't know if we think about that very much, but the kids will tell you that when you have a few kids identified as gifted or going to a special place to learn, the message to the other kids real clearly is the ones that are left behind aren't terribly capable, or they'd be going to that place. And so my preference is to teach up, to understand where it is that, what it is that's going on in the world that we can wrap around these ideas we need, and to present all of them with those things. And then to keep an eye on kids and saying, okay, what's the next step that I can sort of push this kid into, and this kid way over here. We talk about gifted kids as though they were one kind of group. They're not. They're as diverse as any other group of kids in the world. They're kids who are convergently bright, kids who are divergently bright, kids who think they're the best thing since sliced bread, kids who think they have no capacity whatsoever, kids identified that love school and hate school. Rarely are kids from poverty identified and really stretched in that way. If you have a predominantly Caucasian culture, it's pretty rare for kids from cultures other than those to be identified and really nurtured. Kids from low-income backgrounds are relatively infrequently identified and encouraged. I want to put all kids in classrooms, and we can do this, where fine stuff is happening, and look at them as individuals and keep pushing and pulling and moving, and help all the kids see that they can do way more than they ever thought they could. But some of the myths are that bright kids are emotionally unstable. There's a link between real brightness and mental instability. That's been debunked a long time ago, but we still hang on to it. The notion that bright kids don't need us because they're already there, and all that means is they can do grade level work really well, but they absolutely need us to continue to find themselves. That bright kids are good in everything, which is not the case. That they're immature, which is sometimes the case because they may have a 15-year-old brain and a 7-year-old body and a 5-year-old emotional system, and so they look like they're immature. We wouldn't think that so much of a 7-year-old who learned like a 7-year-old and acted sometimes like a 5-year-old, but if you sound like a 15-year-old and then sometimes act like a 5-year-old, we think you're really wacky without really understanding that those systems are distinct from each other. Lots of myths, but my real one, I think, is that there's some kind of kid who has to learn in a room by themselves, that they can't learn dynamically. Now, if nobody's going to teach them in meaningful ways in a regular classroom, then we need to do something someplace else to make that happen. But we ought to be investing a lot first, I think, to help see if we can create environments that are rich enough and supported enough for most kids to flourish.
Okay, now we're moving on to assessment. Some teachers tend to fall back on timed testing as continuous assessment rather than employ different assessment modes, such as projects and group work, pair work, presentations. We know that summative testing creates stress because students perceive testing as a judgment of their intelligence, and as a result, the stress felt is likely to lead to lower performance on the student's part. We also know that the real goal of classroom assessment is to improve student performance, not merely audit it. However, the latter is very highly likely to happen here locally. What are the attributes of effective assessment practices in order to encourage and enhance growth mindset within the classroom?
One of the things that I learned late, and I'm sorry it was so late, was that one of the real characteristics of an excellent assessment is that it enables the student to demonstrate all of what he or she knows about a subject area, about content. And many of our assessments measure just a teeny strip, just a small bit of what kids learn. So we also know that many summative assessments, not true for all of them, but many of them are right answer, matching, fill in the blank, completion, whatever. And those are snippets, again, of information, but they don't really make meaning. And because we have a world into which kids need to go as meaning makers, we need to be using assessments that cause kids to demonstrate understanding and to apply what they're learning and to transfer it to situations that are brand new and to be able to say, wow, there's a connection between this and this thing. There's a place for what we call closed assessments or right answer assessments, just to see, does the kid have fundamental knowledge? But beyond that, I think we need to be using what we would call performance assessments, sometimes products or performances or demonstrations or any number of things that are like that. But that idea that an assessment should cause you to be able to show everything you know is not likely to happen very much on a closed-ended assessment. And so if for no other reason, we need those other kinds of assessments that are more well-rounded, so a kid can show us whether he understands or whether she can apply this thing or how she might or might not be able to transfer this to something over here. And so we're creating better assessments in terms of the assessment itself and also in terms of broadening students if we use performances as well as the close-ended things. In addition to that, not all students are going to express things well in the same way. So some students are great at writing an essay, but a student with a learning disability might not be. And that doesn't mean he's worthless or ought to be made to feel worthless. A student who's learning the language of the classroom might not be too good at writing a paragraph or an essay. A student who is highly stressed emotionally might not be so good at that. But if you say to kids, here are 3 ideas I have for how you can answer this major question or how you can demonstrate this segment of knowledge. And if you have a 4th idea or a 5th idea, check with me. And we can see if we can make that work out. My goal is for you to have a way to express your knowledge that shows me the maximum of what you know, understand, and can be able to do here. And so, we tend to give those closed-ended things again, because that's what was given to us, because we are more comfortable, not always rightfully comfortable, but comfortable creating those kinds of things. They're easier to create than the performance type things. They're easier to grade because you go check X, 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 and you add that up than the performance things. But the performance things stretch us as teachers and stretch kids and opened up worlds of possibility. And you're correct that in today's world, especially, where test performance has gotten to be such a huge thing in many of our schools, we have some kids that are almost traumatized by tests. I'm going to fail this again. I've never been any good at it. See, here's the first test and I already can't do this. And kids who are highly motivated, either self-motivated or with adult motivation, join there to be the best in the class, to go to the best school, to have the best portfolio when they leave high school, are often in kind of a hot mess when it comes to taking a test because of all that stress. And those tests don't often show kids in any meaningful way how to move forward. It's just, you missed this many, and so here's your grade, now let's move on. And if we have performances and formative assessments and that kind of thing, we're much more likely to be able to enable kids to develop agency and understand what learning is really like and how to be champions of their own learning.
As just mentioned, there is much emphasis on convergent assessment with young students, which conditions their brain for rote knowledge recall at the expense of developing higher level executive functions. Why do you think this happens, and what are the effects on the brain and the children's learning when taking up this mode of assessment? You partially answered it previously, the stress and the negative emotions that come about.
So another story. In the US, we have been focused on that kind of assessment, especially year-end assessments that are, nationally normed and that kind of thing for 35 years now. We've been trying to teach kids right answers, make sure they get those closed-ended responses right. The pressure is really huge to do that. And there are a number of things that happen along the way that are sad. One is that we see so many kids decide early on they aren't learners because they can't seem to do very well on that. Trying to get them to memorize a ton of facts and information, and as they grow in the years, there's just more information and teachers trying harder and faster to cover everything, and that doesn't work for a really a lot of learners, and they give up on themselves because they really have two choices. They can either continue to see themselves fail and then look in the mirror and say, I'm a failure, or they can continue to see that happen and look in the mirror and say, you know what, school is rotten, it stinks, there's no purpose in it, it's not for me, it makes no sense, I shouldn't affiliate with it. We're actually better if they do the second thing, if they see us as losers rather than seeing themselves as losers, but that's one fallout from that. The second is that we feel like we don't have time to do things that cause kids to think deeply, or to understand convergence and divergence, and to realize how they can do both and in which situations either or a marriage of the two is to their benefit. We just don't feel like we have time to do that. For kids with learning issues, learning disabilities of various kinds and other learning issues, or kids with emotional trauma that memorize all this stuff when my brain is taxed and on overload, and it's the very thing I cannot do, is destructive emotionally for a lot of them. But here's one of the things that this is my story, that I saw happen during the years that I was at the university. The University of Virginia is where I teach, and that's a place this week where 3 students were murdered, and it's an incredibly sad time there, but it's a very highly rated college. Sometimes people call it the #1 public Ivy. We think of Ivy League schools in this country as Harvard and Princeton and Yale and those places. And University of Virginia is a public college. The state of Virginia funds it, sort of. And so it has real high expectations. And the students who were there in the early years that I were teaching there were just so amazing to watch. They'd come in with this, I have this idea and I don't know if it'll really work, but can I try this and see where it goes? Or this is something I really want to do. Can you sort of point me in a direction that I can go to make that happen? After we had been in pursuit of what you're talking about for about 20 years, memorize this information and put it down on the test and get a good score, and then you too might be able to go to the University of Virginia. The same age students in the same classes would come and they would say, that thing you're asking us to do, you have to think to be able to do that. You just tell us what you want us to know and we'll learn it, but we don't want to have to do all that other stuff. That's terrifying for a country and for a group of people. And many of us continued to work with that for the last 10 or 15 years I was there. But that was a continuous struggle. People in the engineering department would come and ask us in the ed school, this is what we're seeing with students. What are we doing wrong? What is it? And it was the same thing. They had been taught that right answers on a test score, right answers to get a high test score was the game for education. And in the engineering school, they were saying, don't ask us to figure this stuff out. Just tell us what to learn and we'll do it. That disables a whole society. And those are the bright kids that we have disabled. And then kids who never saw themselves as bright, we disable to the degree that they gave up on learning and gave up on themselves. So I think we know a lot about how the brain learns and why it's important to enrich all parts of the brain. But if we don't, we can just look around at this crazy, complicated world. And it does not need right answer getters to go out there and help us figure out how to save the climate or how to create societies in which all people feel belonging and nurtured. We don't need right answers for that. We need thinkers and people who are fully developed in that way. So you can take either argument. The brain doesn't like memorization, or it's sad when we see kids not doing those things, or we're all sunk if we don't help them develop those skills. Any one of those choices you want will do.